Hello, I'm Sami Zaidan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, from farms to factories, India's Prime Minister wants to transform his country's economy. But what do his plans mean for frustrated agricultural workers? Also this week, Japanese consumers are cutting back on spending. And as Japan slipped into recession, it's lost its ranking as the world's third largest economy. Plus, a higher price to pay if you have a sweet tooth. Cocoa prices are soaring and chocolate makers are feeling the pinch. Agriculture employs close to half of India's workforce, but generates less than 20% of GDP. Millions of smallholder farmers who've seen their yields and incomes fall are demanding support from the government. Well, Prime Minister Narendra Modi needs their vote soon as he seeks to extend his decade in office. But keeping them happy, well, that's been a challenge. Axel Zaimovich reports.
Engulfed in tear gas, these farmers have been marching to New Delhi, demanding guaranteed crop prices, a request the government refuses.
It is the duty of the government that they should give us minimum support price. We are demanding minimum support price for 23 crops. If they agree to it, entire nation will be prosperous. Our entire families will be employed.
For weeks, farmers across India have been taken to the streets. They are unhappy with the conditions provided by the government. Despite their peaceful protests, they've been met with resistance. Farming is the backbone of India's economy. It employs more than half the nation's workforce. People like Jagdev are seeking a guaranteed minimum price at least 50% above production costs to make enough for living.
The problem in farming is high input cost. Sometimes natural calamities also lead to low yields. We don't get a proper price for our crops, which leads to major losses. We have to then take a loan. Farming is no longer profitable.
The dispute began in 2020 with a law aimed at modernizing farming by removing middlemen and fixed prices, which farmers say benefits large corporations. A year-long standoff led to Prime Minister Narendra Modi repealing the law. Despite promises to double their salaries, their financial conditions have worsened.
After the laws were withdrawn in 2021, the demands were not met, so they are back with those demands. They are demanding something as simple as a simple guarantee, which is MSP, which is minimum support price at which the government buys their crops, which means they are asking for just an assured income for themselves, a kind of a safety net.
Unions are also demanding loan waivers for small farmers and a minimum wage for agricultural workers. The government says it's open to negotiations.
The efforts will continue to speak to the farmers' unions in a constructive and positive manner. We are ready to hold dialogue with them.
These protests are taking place as India is preparing for national elections by the end of the month. Some say they could potentially affect Prime Minister Modi's re-election. Axel Zaimovich, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Well, joining us now from New Delhi in India is Jayant Krishna. He's a senior fellow in US-India Policy Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Good to have you with us. Are farmers right to demand higher guaranteed crop prices?
See, from farmers' perspective, they're right in demanding that. But let's understand, too much of... one is that they're talking about all crops to come under the minimum support price, that is MSP. And which is, they're talking about a 50% profit over the cost of production, and which is also in line with, with the noted scientist MS Swaminathan's committee's recommendations, which talked about 1.5 times of the cost of production should be the minimum support price for the key crops, But I don't think, it may be wise to do that. Let's understand India. Among all farmers in India, almost 86% of them are small and marginal farmers, and they do not tend to get benefited by MSP as much as the large farmers, So I think too much of protection under MSP extending to all crops, which is already there for wheat and paddy, but to extend it to all other crops to my mind, it will distort, market forces. And also it will disregard the demand and supply situation. Too much of protection under MSP would lead to some crops, having a situation of overproduction, and there could be a shortage of, other food grains.
What about prices, Jayant? Will it lead to price increases and inflation in food prices for consumers?
It may lead to that kind of a challenge, because if you extend MSP to all crops, it will put a huge amount of budgetary burden on Government of India, on the federal government, and also it will lead to inequitable distribution. If there is a lack of balance between demand and supply, it may lead to food inflation as well. So I personally do not think it is wise to extend MSP to all crops. And also let's look at,
right.
Your report earlier talked about the 2020 reforms, which were brought in, also passed by the parliament, but the bills were repealed. To my mind, that mechanism was more market-led. And
all
was
right,
not,
hold that thought. I'm glad you've mentioned the 2020, the 2021 era, but hold that thought for a second, because we need to just remind ourselves a little bit of background of what's going on in the bigger picture. Modi, of course, wants to turn India into a developed nation. Well, the economy is expected to grow 7.3% this year. It's also on track to become the world's third largest economy by 2030, overtaking Japan and Germany. A major driver of that growth is infrastructure. More than $130 billion has been allocated to build assets like roads and ports this year. India is also trying to boost its manufacturing sector, which accounts for nearly 17% of GDP. It aims to replace China as a global production hub. But factories are struggling to fill vacancies, despite Modi's pledge to create higher-paying jobs. Well, critics say inequality is rising and growth is fueled by sectors that don't help poor people in rural areas. The average per capita income in the South Asian nation is nearly $2,500 a year, and that's less than a quarter of China's. So talking about the poor people being left out of this, why is it taking so long, Jayant, to address the challenges of farming conditions? Because as we were talking a minute ago, this has been going on since 2020, or the protests at least, right?
See, let's understand, agriculture contributes only 15%, of India's GDP, And if you look at, we don't have exact data, but, the range anywhere between, 35% to 45% of the workforce depends, their livelihood is depends on agriculture, So it's a very lopsided situation, and it's happening in all countries that workforce is moving away from agriculture. So the challenge is, how do you create more jobs? So in India also the same thing is happening. People are moving away from agriculture because the just 15% of GDP cannot feed 40% of the workforce. So they are moving away. But the challenge is, how do you create more jobs? So far on the government's track record, has not been as good as it has been on other fronts. So I think the biggest challenge India is facing today is to create more and more jobs. I think, and if that happens, the shifting of labor force away from agriculture, would get absorbed in these new sectors. And for that, as you rightly said, I think government has to, the Skill India mission which the Prime Minister had embarked upon, I think it needs to be given a fresh lease of life. Somehow I get a feeling it has run out of steam. But skills are very, very, very important. If India has to reap a rich demographic dividend, we have to educate and skill our people appropriately, which is very, very important, which is government's priority. But somewhere I get a feeling among a plethora of things, it has taken a bit of a backseat.
All right, Jayant, they may be moving away from agriculture, but it's still a big employer when you look at the numbers, of people in India and how many people are engaged in agriculture, right? Is there also a challenge here in improving efficiency of the agricultural sector and productivity?
Yeah, so that's a big challenge. If you look at paddy, the rice and wheat, these two crops, and the productivity the average productivity that you get in India is roughly half of what you get in pockets in the US and even pockets of China, kind of a thing. So I think productivity has to go up, more and more modern science and technology, more equipment needs to be used in farming. I think that's like a writing on the wall. But the problem is, how does it happen if 86% of the farmers are small and marginal, and they have a hand-to-mouth kind of existence? So do they have the support mechanism to adopt and embrace more technology, more equipment, and so on and so forth?
Let me ask, I'm glad you mentioned that. Is the government's interim 2024 budget providing that support? Is it doing enough?
To some extent, yes. There are some credit guarantee programs. There are also some farmers' loans which have been agreed upon. But again, this is a kind of segment of farmers.
Well, they're still not happy, though. They're protesting. How do you think this standoff is going to end?
I think protest is also partly political because they know Lok Sabha elections, parliament elections are around the corner. So the farmers also feel that the government would be more vulnerable at this stage to prolong any crisis. And so it's politically very well timed. I'm not saying farmers don't have a problem. They have huge challenges. But the timing of the protest has got something to do with the forthcoming elections. And I fundamentally believe last time when the reforms happened, there was during COVID, there was a lack of dialogue between the government and the farmers. There has to be more dialogue, and all the three laws could be brought on the table for a fresh discussion in a spirit of partnership and in a win-win kind of a mode.
All right. I'm afraid we're out of time. Thanks so much, Jayant, for your analysis on that. After years of deflation, Japan is now seeing inflation with the fastest price growth in more than 30 years. But wages are failing to keep up with the rising cost of living. And the Japanese, well, they're not spending as much as they were. That's slowed economic activity. The yen's value to the dollar has gone south. Japan's economy has now slipped into a recession. It's dropped a rank below Germany to become the world's fourth largest economy. We'll get into that with our guests shortly. But first, let's talk about what is a recession. Well, it's when the economy shrinks for 2 consecutive quarters, measured by a decrease in gross domestic product. Well, that's known as a technical recession because only one part of the economy suffers, whereas a full recession, well, that affects multiple sectors for a sustained period. And it affects people who face job losses and reduced income, leading to difficulties in paying bills, securing loans, and maintaining savings. Businesses, on the other hand, well, they struggle with decreased sales and potential bankruptcy. Let's have a closer look at what happened in Japan. Shop owners and consumers say they're feeling the pinch.
Of course we feel it. I feel that the way customers shop is changing. They would bring shopping lists, but now, to protect their way of living, they are coming to see what the bargains are, and then deciding what to buy.
I've had a pay cut, so I've stopped buying clothes and eating out in order to save money.
Well, joining us from Tokyo is Jesper Cole, director of the investment advisory firm Monex Group Japan. He's a former chief economist at JP Morgan and Merrill Lynch. Good to have you with us, sir. So we got this unusual situation, I guess, where we're seeing corporate profits surging, the stock market is rising, unemployment rates are low, and yet Japan's economy unexpectedly fell into recession. Why?
It's very straightforward. You remember that in this country, 1 in 4 is now living off a pension. It's a very old society. Average age is 50 years old. 1 in 4 people is actually over 70 now. And as a result of that, you're living off your pension, which means that food prices going up, energy prices going up. All of this is eating into your purchasing power. So the gap between corporate Japan doing extremely well, and therefore the stock market surging, and the average people, that gap is widening.
Will we see then wages increase if prices are going up?
Yes, and you're doing that. You're seeing that wages for the people in their 20s and 30s are actually growing by 4, 5, 6%. So, for the young generation, everything is fine. But as I said, you've got this sort of barbell where now 25% of the people are over 70 and they don't feel, the surge in incomes. And quite frankly, they're not going to feel it because they live off pensions, not of wages.
So what is the solution for that very tricky situation with people on pensions?
I don't think it's a very tricky situation. It's just par for the course. In the sense of that, as a society ages, the increase in asset prices, the increase in competitiveness of corporations does not necessarily translate into GDP or national income. So, it's a great country to be in. It's a wonderful country to invest in with plenty of opportunities. And the quality of life is still absolutely second to none, particularly for the younger generation.
All right, a lot of eyes are on the Bank of Japan right now. Do you think it's going to move ahead with the country's first rate increases since 2007?
I think the answer is yes. I do expect a normalization of interest rates. Remember, we had basically zero emergency interest rates for almost one generation, for almost 25 years, and normalizing interest rates by giving a little bit of a price of money, short-term interest rates going to 20, 25 basis points. That's in the cards, but it does not mean that there is a tightening of monetary policy. It's a normalization of liquidity conditions, not the central bank stepping on the brake.
All right, what impact then might it have on the yen? Because that's an important question, isn't it, for exporters too?
You're absolutely right, and I've learned the hard way that what matters is not so much Japanese interest rates, but it is US interest rates. In other words, if indeed the Federal Reserve were to start to increase interest rates 1 or 2 more times, that obviously would give a further boost to the dollar. In contrast, you find that the moves by the Bank of Japan, if at all, are going to be very incremental and not dramatic. So I do think that the dollar is poised to increase further.
All right, let's talk about the bottom line here. A shrinking population. Can Japan then ever recover its number 3 spot?
No, absolutely not. But Japan's corporations will continue to gain competitiveness. You've got a new generation of CEOs who are aggressive, making new acquisitions. Just look at Nippon Steel buying US Steel. I mean, that's a very aggressive move. So the gap between GDP Japan and corporate competitive Japan Inc., that gap is going to widen. And don't worry, the quality of life stays very high because public infrastructure remains excellent here in Japan. So a more competitive corporate sector and still a very high quality of life here in Tokyo.
Well, what should the Japanese government do to spur more growth and perhaps try and look at that gap?
So, this is where it gets very interesting. In the end, there is one primary answer, which is to allow more immigration. And the authorities here in Japan are doing this. The visa regulations for workers, for digital nomads, for university students, etc. All of these visa regulations are being eased. So, if you really want to return to a 2-3% growth economy, you're going to have to loosen up further on immigration bills.
All right, Jesper Cole there. Thanks so much. Good to talk to you. Now, the British economy also fell into a technical recession at the end of last year, but the Bank of England said the UK is showing signs of recovery. Many economists have urged the Bank of England to lower borrowing costs to help revive the economy. Chancellor Jeremy Hunt says that could happen soon.
The underlying picture here is an economy that is more resilient than most people predicted. Inflation is coming down, real wages have been going up now for 6 months. And if we stick to our guns, independent forecasters say that by the early summer we could start to see interest rates falling, and that will be a very important relief for families with mortgages.
Well, now let's hear from some British people about how they feel about the contraction of the economy.
I think things are steadily picking up. It's still quite hard. I think second half of the calendar year things will improve for the better. We probably need a general election just to sort of burst the bubble and allow us all to move on. Gives a sense of direction in terms of investment from business and so on. But ultimately I'm pretty optimistic. But I appreciate there are people still looking for jobs. It's hard, but it will get better.
I think it's a symptom of what we've been through over the last, how many years now? 13 years of a government that seems intent on getting out of Europe and destroying our economy.
Well, chocoholics may have to fork out more to satisfy their cravings. The main ingredient, of course, is cocoa, which mostly comes from West Africa. The price of the beans hit a record high of nearly $5,900 a tonne more than a week ago. Manufacturers are worried the increase could damage their business. That's because the price of cocoa has surged by nearly 90% since last year. Major producers, including the maker of Cadbury and Toblerone, reported a slump in sales. Chocolate lovers are starting to feel the impact as some prices have almost doubled, making the once sweet escape come at a bitter cost. Well, joining us from Amsterdam in the Netherlands is Anthony Fountain. He's the managing director of the Voice Network and co-author of the Cocoa Barometer. Good to have you with us. So let's start with the obvious one then, Anthony. Why are cocoa prices rising?
Cocoa prices are rising because supply is low. And supply is low because of a combination of bad weather, and that's a result also of climate change and the El Nino weather pattern that we're seeing at the moment, but also because of an outbreak of several crop diseases in West Africa, because of the threat of gold mining to cocoa production in West Africa, and because farmers are they've been underpaid for so long that there's not really a future for them in cocoa. And so they're not really doing their best to grow a lot of cocoa at the moment because it's not worth it.
Is this something that West Africa can do to take care of some of the structural issues at least?
Obviously, and I think that government policies make a huge difference in what is and what isn't able to be done there. So invest in infrastructure, invest in better education, and invest in diversified production and agroforestry versus just cutting down all the forests to grow cocoa, right? So those are things that the governments can do, but most of those will have at best a medium to long-term effect on what's going on.
What about the prices of other commodities? Are they contributing to the challenge chocolate producers are facing?
The cocoa price peak is quite unique to cocoa at the moment because it's really a cocoa-specific problem. But we're dealing with the problem across all crops and across many decades now. And it's not just in tropical commodities, where farmers are simply not being paid the price they need to have a good livelihood. This is also why we're seeing a lot of farmer protests in Europe at the moment as well. Our global food system is not aimed at paying a fair price to farmers. It's aimed at driving the price down as low as you possibly can get, because we as consumers want the cheapest possible products. And so
our market
the system
force is sufficient to deal with that at the end of the day? Do you see any hope?
I don't think that market forces are sufficient to help the farmer. Market forces work very well further down the supply chain, but we've known for decades that the market actually doesn't work well in paying the farmers properly. And in fact, the architect of the Common Agricultural Policy, a Dutch politician, many years ago, after he invented the European Common Agricultural Policy, said, actually, supply and demand works very badly for farmers. And that's why we think farming needs to be paid remuneratively and not based on supply and demand.
All right, what about chocolate makers now? How are they dealing with this challenge? Simply passing the
Everyone is
bill
quite
on?
concerned. Everyone is quite concerned about these high prices. When I say everyone, I mean everyone in the cocoa sector, the buyers, etc. Not so much for the prices, although that is a challenge, but they're concerned because the prices are high, because there's low supply. And if there's low supply, at some point, that means that there's not going to be enough cocoa to make all of the chocolate that we're used to consume.
But is
And so I
demand
think
going down? Are we seeing demand for chocolate decrease?
Not yet, but that's also because the big price hike hasn't actually reached the stores yet, because cocoa gets sold a year and a half in advance. And so the prices that we're seeing now aren't translated to the chocolate prices quite yet. That'll take quite a while before it officially gets there.
All right, do you think we're going to see the prices rise anytime soon, given all the factors you've mentioned? Or go down, I should say.
I would be surprised if chocolate prices went down. I think they will go up because companies are quite good at kind of translating their increased costs to consumers. So that will definitely happen. At first, people thought this high price was going to be a short-term temporary thing because of a weather anomaly. At the moment, more and more analysts are thinking this will take quite some time still, at least a year, if not longer. So I don't think chocolate prices are going to be coming down anytime soon.
Are we going to see shrinkflation, where they shrink the size of the product instead?
Well, that's what we've seen every time so far. When cocoa prices are high, they either indeed shrink the size of the bar. I think Toblerone did that quite spectacularly in a problematic way a few years ago when it happened the last time. But you see companies making their packages smaller, but sometimes also putting in a whole bunch of extra ingredients in that aren't cocoa, but that are cheaper. So expect to see more kinds of chocolate with lots of other ingredients in it.
All right, thanks so much for joining us on this sweet topic.
Thank you very much.
And that's our show for this week. But remember, you can get in touch with us via Twitter. Use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Sami Zaidan from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.